Brian, one thing I realized in our introspection journey, in my introspection journey, is hitting that snooze button is actually a really definitive form of procrastination. And procrastination, the more I dug into it and the more that you and I talked about it, turns out to be a really limiting factor. This kind of starts to disrupt any positive progress we make in our introspection journey. And so today, Brian and I want to talk about what that means for us and what are some of the common factors of why we procrastinate, but also what we've learned from overcoming certain parts of our procrastination, certain things that we do. We still procrastinate. Doesn't mean you get over all of it, but we still have a few things that we've learned that we wanted to share with you. And that's why I love doing this podcast with Brian and reacting and interacting with all of you online on the Introspection Hour with Brian and Patrick to really dive down into what is affecting all of us. And in particular, the three or so factors of what we found of why we procrastinate. They kind of go around with one, the failure of procrastination, the failure aspect. Two, the managing or really the lack of managing of our emotions. And procrastination is not a time management issue, it's an emotion issue. And third, you actually get rewarded for procrastinating. And that's a bad thing. Being rewarded is a bad thing in this case. And we'll explain that. So, Brian, start us off here and talking about the failure aspects of procrastination and just kind of why that's a key factor and why that leads us or leads most of us to procrastinate.
You would never actually assume that there are specific issues that lead to procrastination, right? We all assume that we're all just lazy people, we'll just get it done later. But when you actually sit down and think about why we procrastinate, if you're able to break it down into these three fundamental components, it actually makes a lot of sense. This idea that our fear of failure, or rather the fear of taking action, leads to procrastination is, we could, let's say, for example, when we're back in high school or in college and we have let's say a term paper or an essay that we have to write. And most of us have the hardest time just initially getting something done or written down on paper is because we have this inclination that it has to be perfect when we start writing, or we have to know exactly what we're going to be talking about before we could actually start on this paper or this project. And I feel like that happens to a lot of us. Let's say we're learning a new skill such as piano or a language, or if we say we want to start on a new project, is that we feel like everything has to, at least for me, everything has to be perfect or everything has to be laid out completely before I can get started. And it's kind of like this analysis by paralysis where we feel like we have to know everything there is to know about a specific subject matter before we can get started. And for many of us, we don't like to make mistakes, which is a very, very common thing with things associated with failures, that we don't like to make mistakes, because it kind of leads into this second topic where you talk about managing our emotions, is that when we make mistakes, it's kind of like attacking our pride and our ego. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And you're left with this option of either getting it done or not doing it at all, right? Because it's that fear part of us that comes into play so much in our minds. And one thing that I was listening to, it just kind of caught my attention, is that we are wired, our brains are wired to protect us. So if we have this failure and this fear of failure, it's going to actually make us scared of it and scared of actually doing it, to the point where our brains are going to actually try to stop us from doing that one thing that we need to do, writing that blog post, making a video, whatever it is. And so when we say there's a failure aspect to procrastination, if you're approaching some sort of activity and you think you're going to fail, or you're afraid of failing at that one thing that you need to do, then that's actually causing you to procrastinate, right? And so that's kind of something that we both learned, and is a little bit of an eye-opener. And it's a little bit different because failure is such a strong emotion. Fear is such a strong emotion. But what we really wanted to talk about in our second point is that procrastination will come out of actually us mismanaging or not managing our emotions. And whether it's your pride, your ego, it's not good enough, it's a failure, it's an insecurity, it's any emotion that you could think of that isn't positive, that keeps you stuck, is usually one of the reasons or one of the emotions causing you to procrastinate, right? And so I can relate to this. There's a sense of like, in work, I sometimes have to do meeting minutes. Okay. And so for those of you that might not be in the office culture, basically we have these meetings that seem to go on, and someone takes notes, and then you got to do minutes, basically typing up what was discussed so that people can refer to it. It is one of the most boring jobs of tasks that I have to do in my job. And honestly, Brian, my pride and my ego, because I've got to myself to a certain point in my career, it's like, man, I should have an assistant. I should have a junior person working on this. Like someone should be doing this for me, right? That's so prideful. And in the end, everyone in that room was above me in one sense, or they were more important than me. So I was the junior person in the room, which means that, okay, do the meeting minutes, but it's not that hard. It's not hard. It doesn't require a lot of thought. It's not something that I can't do. I could probably do it in 30 minutes in and out, right? But I spent hours avoiding it, procrastinating, because my pride I just couldn't get over the fact that like, I'm doing meeting minutes still in my career after, 14 years or whatever. Like that is purely not procrastination. It is procrastination, but it's me not managing my emotion. It's me not getting over myself, right? And when I finally get to the point, I'm like, no, you know what? I need to do this. I said I was going to do it. I'm already late. Go do it. And that's how I've kind of learned that, okay, my emotions have a big factor on whether I procrastinate on something in every aspect of my life, right? What other emotions have you come across that's like actually making you procrastinate besides, let's say, fear or pride?
As far as emotion goes, Pat, I think the most obvious one for a lot of people is our ego, where we don't want to essentially damage our ego, because I feel like our ego is kind of like our sense of self, right? And I remember back in 2019 of December where I was trying to learn salsa dancing. And I swear to God, this is like my second or third time actually trying to learn. But anyways, I told myself that night, like, you know what? I'm going to actually figure out how to move my feet and how to actually learn how to be a salsa dancer. And I'm not going to lie, I still don't know how to salsa dance, but whatever, right? And throughout the night, as I was learning from the instructor, we had this one time where we had basically a free dance lesson, or not free dance lesson, but like free session where you just kind of practice on your own, learning the steps that you had learned throughout the hour. And as I was just kind of dancing on my own, I had a few people come up and approach me and just ask me if I want to dance. And I told them straight up like, hey, I'm sorry, I would love to dance, but I'm just not very good. And it was surprising that they're like, you know what, it's okay, don't worry, we'll dance together and we'll just kind of practice the same basic steps. And I've seen these people, I saw that these people were dancing and they knew how to actually do the steps and do more fancier techniques versus me just kind of learning the basic foot steps. But it taught me that, it doesn't really matter. Like as much as we want to protect our ego, if we just put ourselves out there, we actually learn to have a good time. I know this is a very, very important concept for a lot of people. Let's say, particularly for those who are in a science and research team. Let's say, for example, we all know who Edison is, who's the inventor of the light bulb. And I remember this one particular quote where he said, it's like, I figured out 2,000 ways on not how to create the light bulb. And I think that's important for a lot of us. It's like we need to put our ego aside, put our pride aside in order to continue to make those mistakes. Because when we're willing to make those mistakes, we are essentially growing from all of those things that we have essentially failed from, right? And it allows us for creativity and for creation, because as we continue, like this podcast, we continue to work and develop and continue to eventually get better and better. And ultimately, we will eventually get better in whatever it is that we're doing and whatever it is that we're working on. You know what I mean?
So yeah, I mean, we've been talking about, failure and fear because it's a really strong emotion. So just recognize that, especially in your own lives, and managing these emotions, whether it be pride, ego, whatever else kind of comes into your particular introspection journey. There's one thing that crept up on both of us when we were realizing and thinking about procrastination that kind of surprised us when we realized what it was, which is procrastination is a cycle that feeds itself because you get rewarded for procrastinating. And so what does that mean? If just like you saw earlier in the beginning of the video, if you hit the snooze button, I get rewarded for that. Every time I hit the snooze button, I get rewarded for procrastinating from actually waking up, which is I get to sleep in more. And we all do it and we all know it. But it's those decisions that build up over our entire day and our lives that actually leads us to procrastinate more. So then we can justify it on other things that we do. And this is really this concept that kind of blew my mind, Brian, because we as people like to be rewarded. Who doesn't? Right? You do something, you get rewarded. I realize that feeds itself. So the more I hit the snooze button, the more I get to sleep in, the more I can avoid waking up. So I'm just procrastinating waking up. And then you apply that concept to everything else that you're procrastinating in, and you realize, oh, wow, like kind of that song. My mind is playing tricks on me, man. Like you're getting rewarded for procrastinating. Right, Brian? I mean, like, what was your initial reaction when you learned that when you learned that concept?
So in my opinion, Patrick, this reward system works in a way where it's more of a fear avoidance reward system. So for example, going back to our first and second topics, or first and second segments regarding why most people procrastinate, the reward that we get is basically avoiding that symptom or that feeling of failure, or those feelings of feeling like we're putting our ego out there. And that in and of itself is a reward system. Because I know when we talk about reward, we're talking about getting something in return, right? Getting a gift, getting some type of acknowledgement for something that we had done. But in this particular case, we are indirectly rewarding ourselves by not putting ourselves in those situations of feeling like we're inadequate or feeling like we are failing. You know what I mean? And that's the reward system that we're actually talking about, is that indirect reward system of actually not being in those specific emotions or those specific mindsets.
I think that leads into a really interesting study that was conducted a couple of decades ago, and it revolves around the concept of delayed gratification and what the benefits came out of it. It's commonly known as like the marshmallow study, right? Like Brian, you do a really great job of explaining the marshmallow study. So explain it for everyone that's hearing about it and thinking about s'mores. Yeah.
So the marshmallow study was conducted back in 1970s by a group of Stanford researchers. And what they wanted to find out was whether or not delayed gratification had any merits to it. So what they ended up doing was recruiting a couple of kids, and they put them in a room. And the situation was like, you could either have the marshmallow that is placed on the table right now, or if you wait about 15 minutes, we'll double the price, meaning we'll give you another set of marshmallow, or we'll give you another set of treat. And what they ended up finding out was that obviously there's a couple of kids who were unable to delay their gratification and of course eat the marshmallows right away, but the other half obviously were able to delay their reward system. And what they ended up doing later on was doing a longitudinal study following up on the kids who basically were able to delay their gratification, and also compared those who weren't. And what the interesting thing is that they found out that the people who were able to delay their gratification, meaning they did not get the marshmallow right away, they had higher SAT scores, they were able to improve just overall educational, they had less body mass index, meaning they were, I guess, more physically fit, right? Had a lower BMI, and as well as other quality life measures compared to those who were unable to delay and basically just like, I want my marshmallow right away. And when you think about this, Patrick, it makes a lot of sense why the kids who were able to delay their gratification were more likely to succeed. Because again, going back to our reward system, right? When we're able to, let's say in school, elementary school, high school, college, if we're able to come home and instead of throwing on the TV, which is essentially a reward system, right? To increase our dopamine factors in our head, or playing video games or hanging out with our friends, and we spend the time to actually delay that reward system and actually spend the time to study, get our homework done, and just do other things that are not really keeping our reward system active, you could see why you would score better in things like the SAT scores, and educational life factors, lower BMI, so on and so forth. It's because you're able to delay your reward system and put in the actual effort, and in lack of a better word, you're not procrastinating as much, right? You're not putting off the things that need to be done in order for you to have a good time.
No, you're absolutely right. And that's why when we would approach an assignment and those kids that, delayed their gratification for the 2 marshmallows, they would be able to actually start and finish their assignments, the things that they wanted to do. And that led to greater success because they got their things done. They weren't procrastinating. They weren't doing things last minute. And all the other benefits that comes from delaying gratification, which is in the children's case, go play with your friends. Even in high school, it's go play with our friends. So that concept is a really good reminder of why we need to break the habits of procrastination, the things in our lives that we procrastinate on. It doesn't mean you have to do all of them, but just start with one. And this is a really good time to just kind of take a pause from this whole procrastination. And as we, even call ourselves the Introspection Hour, there is a bit of introspection here that we wanted to point out, which is when you're going through this, everyone is so hard on themselves. They are their biggest critic. The one thing that we want to tell people is if you're dealing and you're trying to overcome procrastination, you do need a level of self-awareness and actually self-empathy, self-forgiveness, self-compassion. In other words, everything that we try to share in being a positive and good person out in the world, you got to do that to yourself. Because procrastination is something that's definitely individual, where someone can't really help you. A time management scheduler is not going to help you if you don't have enough compassion for yourself, if you don't give yourself a little bit of runway to actually fail and forgive yourself for failing. So we just want to make sure that whether you're working on your health, you're like me and you try to exercise for the last 30 odd years and you fail at it every single time after 1 month, or your money management is not there, give yourself a little bit of compassion and a little bit of forgiveness and empathy, and just be aware of how much pressure you're putting on yourself when you don't need to, right? And so you've been one where, for our friendship and, ever since we started this, you've been talking about a lot of different things that you've changed and things that have actually worked for you, right? And so you've overcome procrastination in different parts of your life, and you probably picked up a couple of good, tips and tricks and suggestions. So what are some suggestions you have for everyone listening?
Patrick, one of the things that I realize is that there is no real way to fix procrastination. I know as much as people want to told, if you take my program, you take my course, then we'll fix your problem, right? But I feel like that's not really a good way to look at things. The better answer to how did I fix my procrastination is rather, how can you better manage my procrastination, right? In this case, how did I manage my procrastination? So what I ended up doing actually was creating a daily list or daily goals of what I want to accomplish for that specific day. And it's funny that I actually have 3 monitors, where I have 2 monitors that are kind of horizontal and 1 specific monitor where I actually keep it vertical. And that monitor is specifically only to showcase and highlight my daily tasks for the day. That is pretty much it. Because one of the things that helps me out is that I need to be able to visually see what it is that I need to accomplish for the day. And I remember there's this one book written by Brian Tracy. It's called Eat That Frog. And the basic concept of this book is to basically do the hardest tasks first, meaning eat that frog. And that's kind of how I manage my procrastinations. Oh, and one more thing regarding the snooze thing. So what I ended up doing in the morning is I would set my cell phone, basically about 20 feet away from where my bedroom is. And you can kind of see my bed here, but I would basically put it in a place where it actually forces me to get up. And I feel like if most people have an issue such as you, who are constantly snoozing and just another 5 minutes, another 10 minutes, this is actually a really good way to manage that snoozing issue, where if you're forced to put your phone away in an area where you actually have to get up, more often than not, you're not gonna hit the snooze button and go back to bed. I mean, at least I hope not. You know what I mean?
Some of the things that have helped me out is similar to you, but I've had to actually picture what the end goal is. If you don't really know what you're working towards, or you don't know what you're trying to break out of, then it gets really hard. You're so narrow-minded, and you're not seeing kind of, I don't like using this phrase a lot, but big picture, but you do need to visualize yourself somewhere. So as cliche as that sounds, that actually worked for me for whatever reason, right? Maybe it's just the way my brain is wired. The other thing that I do is actually, and similarly, I do the hardest things first. But I also look for what is the most efficient way and time during my day or my week that I can do something or do multiple things. That became really important to me because just even changing locations of where you got to do certain things, whether it's upstairs, downstairs, in a room, different room, right? Like at work or at home, in the car, things like that. What is the most efficient way I can do and accomplish everything I want to do that I'm still present? And one thing that you actually taught me, Brian, especially on the exercise, is getting over that fear has nothing to do is it needs to be grounded in reality. And most of the times we set these stretch goals and we treat those as our immediate goals, which doesn't make sense, right? Like I want to have a strong core and abs and be flexible so I can play with my daughter, right? And then within the first week, I feel horrible. Within the second week, I feel a little bit stronger, but I'm not as strong as I want to be. Because my stretch goal, my ultimate goal, I use that constantly as my immediate goal. And when I don't see my immediate results meet that immediate goal, I put myself down even more. And so for me, what helped me out of that was what you did to me, which was build up to it, right? And just kind of separate it and realize what is the goal I can achieve now versus 6 months from now, a year from now. And in full disclosure, I never made it past 1 month, even with Brian helping me. I think I got about 1 month in good. That's been the longest I've been able to exercise consistently. So it's, I'm horrible at this, people, like this. But it does help. It does help to break it down and to manage it, right? So as much as we manage our emotions, manage your expectations is probably my last suggestion that I have. So Brian, that's just another suggestion I had. And yeah, we had a lot of nuggets of information on this one, right?
So I know we talked a lot about procrastination in this particular episode, and we kind of want to go ahead and just summarize all of the key factors that's kind of associated with procrastination. Obviously, there's more ways than not to describe how many people procrastinate using various techniques, but the three things that we can really identify some of the key factors of why people procrastinate is one, that fear of failure, and how the fear of taking action really limits and holds people back into actually taking some specific action. And two is our ability to manage our emotions, particularly associated with things like pride and ego. And last but not least is just understanding this whole concept of the reward system and realizing that by having some level of delayed gratification, you're able to set yourself up for better success later on in the future, whether you're a child or perhaps even when you're an adult. Like there's never any real reason to not continue to make positive changes in your life. And just remember that if you are struggling with procrastination issues and you realize you need to get things done, just have some self-empathy and self-compassion for yourself and just be forgiving as if you were talking to your best friend. We are not, that's what self-compassion is all about, is being able to just tell ourselves, like, you know what? We are our biggest critic, but that's why we also have to be our biggest savior at the same time, if that makes any sense. And so, again, I gave some of my strategies for how I end up dealing with procrastination, and that's usually through creating some sort of specific daily task that I could visually see on a daily basis, or in Patrick's case, where he prioritizes some of his higher priorities on his list in order to get things done first. And this whole concept of what he uses as a stretch goal, being able to visually see into the future of like what is your ultimate end goal, let's say 6 months from now, 1 year from now, where procrastination would definitely have an effect later on in life.
Yeah, so take those strategies with a grain of salt, everyone. What works for us won't really work for you. But just remember kind of why we actually procrastinate. And so for insights like that and to share in the journey that we all are on, the introspection journey, join us next week for another episode of the Introspection Hour with Brian and Patrick. Thanks, everyone.